knock the gain out? Can I just knock the gain out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too dark, that. Just leave the gain back in, leave it in. It's very quiet. There we go. Connecting. Sorry.
Will we ask for the lights to go down? And the mics to come on. Okay. We need these because they are on. Oh, now, just could we have lights down a bit? Ooh. Lights. This is very blindy. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon session. Just asking for these two lights in the centre to be dimmed a bit, please. Thank you very much. Can't see. Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Dawson, and I'm director of the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. I'd like to thank the Museums Association for inviting me to participate in this excellent conference, and congratulations to all of the organisers for putting together such a diverse and illuminating programmes over the past 2 days. I'm chairing this session, Dissenting Artists, and I'm delighted to introduce my panellists, artists Amanda Dunsmore and Seamus Nolan, and curator Owen Dara. Just before we begin, I was just discussing and reflecting on what the world would be like without art. It would indeed be a very dull place, to be devoid of creativity and to be devoid of imagination, and without imaginative approaches to addressing the complexities of existence. It really doesn't bear thinking about. Over the millennia, art has always challenged the accepted norms and shown other ways of looking at the world. Dissent is inherent in art, and we've seen how art challenges the status quo, the realities as they see them, how we are perceived, and who is represented. What are the contexts, the perspectives? What and who has been put in, and what and who has been left behind? As we move on through the 21st century, these are among the key issues in society, issues which are addressed through current art practices. Even using the traditional media such as sculpture, painting and drawing, and the more relatively new media of film, video, installation, these artists, bringing unique and original viewpoints, address issues of civil and human rights, climate change, democracy, capitalism, migration, economy and society. Counterpoints to populist thinking and indeed stereotypes. In the sense of taking a position, art is political. The artist gives their personal viewpoint and has the freedom to express it. The art of dissent was one of the topics at the World Economic Forum annual meeting last year, and I quote, "In a time of political and economic uncertainty, the role of art and expression has never been so important. They bring new perspectives to tackle challenging issues and inspire people to fulfill their potential." At the Hugh Lane, we have, over a long period now, made it one of our priorities in our exhibition programming and in our learning programs to redefine the role of the museum in terms of platforming participatory and collaborative practices which address current issues in social and political. Each of the panelists will discuss their practice, and then I will, I hope, invite a lively discussion from the floor. And now it's my pleasure to invite Amanda Dunsmore. Amanda works in art processes that explore representations of societal transformation through portraiture. She engages in longitudinal research processes, and she presents her artworks through video, sound, photography, and installation. Her art processes are defined by a series of extensive socio-political historical art projects. And central to her practice is an exploration of the potential future memory, the legacy of visual parity in portraiture, and the long-term implications of socio-political art making. And here she will discuss a series of portrait works exploring the methodology behind her artistic process. Amanda.
Thank you, Barbara. I research and make my portraits from a diverse range of political significant locations. Plan was made in 1997 whilst on residency in the Atelier Gallery in Weimar in the former east of Germany. With the unification of Germany, metal enamel street signs were replaced quickly by plastic ones, with the old street signs were thrown in a bin awaiting disposal. I recovered and cleaned, document, and set up the ongoing preservation and storage of the street signs in Weimar. Geopolitical shifts affect people, and people's react are predictable in the quick discarding of the past, the perception of what is the representation, of place and their past. And I see this as artwork as a portrait of a historical portrait of place. People's reactions can also be unpredictable and surprising. Billy Hull was the senior officer in Her Majesty's Prison Maze here, and I met him in 1998 when I was artist in residence in the maze. Over a period of 15 years, Hull disobeyed an order to destroy materials, and instead he saved them. Because of the nature of the artist in residence, I was bringing in cameras and recording equipment and working with the paramilitary prisoners. I was able to document what Billy had laid out in the old laundry building inside the maze. He had laid them out on trestle tables. This is the resulting film, Billy's Museum, which is 20 minutes, and presents a display of the objects he amassed. Because of my experience of working through and presenting politically sensitive content, I was commissioned to engage with the older LGBT community in County Galway. My art practice is grounded in the ethos of social practice. And the aim of the commission was to connect with this group of people who have lived through dramatic changes in Irish society and create a series of artworks and from their life experience. The currently touring exhibition, Becoming Christine, is a collaborative partnership with Christine Bainon. Becoming Christine is based on the lived experience of Christine as in continually developing body of work involving the representation of selfies, sound installation, video portraiture, and a publication. The selfies follow Christine's journey and the transition over the past 15 years. The legacy of Becoming Christine, in combining specific artist elements which together create an exhibition based in portraiture, is not only reflective of an individual finding themselves, but also reflective of the enormous social political change that has taken place in Ireland and England over the past 60 years. Becoming Christine, the exhibition, is an acknowledgement of this over time of society's progress. Christine's ongoing and remarkable journey to full self-realization and the bravery of this act make her a true pioneer. And as she states, every time she goes out the front door, she's making a political statement. Research is a key element of my art practice. Through researching into the artifacts that are in the previous film, Billy's Museum, I discovered the source of the images for the people's portraits, dating 1899 to 1918. The original glass plate negatives have contained both side and profile images, and I selected and edited 100, which date from the date 1819 to 1918, which is before the partition of Ireland. I'm interested in how, firstly, these individuals are looking directly into the camera. For a lot of them, it would have been the first time that they had been photographed. Also, they are looking back at the audience, and they knew Ireland differently than we know Ireland. Also, they are convicts. And I'm interested in how the audience today is able to equate themselves with these individuals more easily than prisoners today. Over 100 years, the audience has the space to shed the connotations of the prisoner and equate themselves more easily with them. "30 years closer in time, in 1996, the joint Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Mairead Corrigan Maguire and Betty Williams here in Northern Ireland. This slide, these individuals represent a ground-up, non-partisan, civic, mainly women's movement. I had a specific intent in presenting this particular portrait alongside the portraits of David Trimble and John Hume in the recent exhibition at the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago. When I was an artist in residence, at one point, so I had access to all areas in the Maze prison and all H blocks, apart from one area which was on lockdown because they had rioted. And I was in on the wing of the UDA, speaking to the officer in command. A week after the week that Mo Molan had gone in to speak to the loyalist prisoners because they were going to pull out of the Good Friday Agreement. Mo Molan's action stayed with me, and she was the inspiration for the agreement portraits. When I filmed Martin McGuinness, sadly, Mo Molan passed away that morning. I also filmed David Irvine, the Progressive Unionist Party, who was also a prisoner in Long Kesh. David Trimble, by then Lord Trimble, Ulster Unionist Party, filmed in Banbridge, his constituency, last year. Lord Alderdice, Alliance Party, Northern Ireland, filmed in Belfast, 2005. Monica McWilliams, Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition, filmed in Belfast, 2005. John Hume, Social Democratic and Labour Party, or SDLP, filmed in Derry in 2005. This year I filmed Senator George Mitchell when he opened the exhibition in the Hugh Lane. And Senator Mitchell, for me, makes the connection, which is a very strong international connection through President Clinton. He was the envoy, to the connection between America and, of course, the influence of the civil rights on the peace process through John Hume. I have 7 portraits filmed. There are 6 more to do. 2 have agreed. And for me, it's an ongoing, in my art practice, is the ongoing minding of the legacy of these individuals and what they embody. And just to finish, I will read the last section from my essay from the publication. Keeper is about people. The portraits of the peace people, the people's portraits, and the portraits of the key political figures involved in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement embody the people they represented. I had the privilege to meet and film key political figures who relate to Northern Ireland. When Mo Molan passed away, her death ended her presence. Her important contribution has become a faded generational memory, and her significant legacy resides in the words of others. With the death of David Irvine, Ian Paisley, and more recently of Martin McGuinness, societal memory continues to diminish. Their portraits are a formal visual fragment and a representation of their remarkable legacies. Retained in Keeper is a potential for future memory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And now I'd like to invite Seamus Nolan. Seamus is an artist based in Dublin. He is the recent recipient of the EU CAP, Collaborative Arts Participation Programme Commission, with the Hugh Lane in partnership with Create, the National Agency for Collaborative Art Practice, with his project, The Travellers Collection, which is ongoing. Other works include Fourth Space for inhabiting the Bagion in Athens, Pronto Punks with Upstate Theatre Projects Drogheda, Free Shilan Oselect Mayo Arts Collaborative, Fuck Ima for What We Call Love, Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Trades Club Revival, which saw the revival of the traditional Workingman's Club in Sligo, and the attempted hijack of a Ryanair flight NM7104, and the refusal to participate in Dublin Contemporary 2011. Seamus.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm just going to speak about this one project because, as you said, it's an ongoing project, and things are being uncovered, and I'm just discovering things, and so it's kind of in the middle of the process. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about it. So the Traveller Collection project focuses on issues of traveller visibility within national and private cultural institutions, locating representations of travelling people and communities within local and national media. By this I mean within kind of all collections, private and public, where the traveller body begins to appear. Just in case anybody isn't aware, Irish Travellers are an Indigenous Irish group of nomadic people, and the attempts to assimilate travellers into kind of ordinary society, into sedentary society, has been kind of ongoing since the 60s. So in 2017, travellers, after about 30 years of campaigning, were granted ethnic, their status as an ethnic minority was recognised by the Irish state. So I thought at that time it was important to try to consider where travellers and their culture had existed. If it hadn't been an official culture by itself, where did it exist and what did it look like? And how would this sudden acknowledgement, what would it mean for those collections and for those communities? And how could something that was rendered invisible suddenly be made visible? And what would happen to the history that had went before that? So, I proposed to work with Pavey Point and with Hugh Lane as part of the commission, and I was working with an ethnographer, Eve Olney, and we ran a series of workshops in traveller organisations and communities, which again are ongoing. The organisations and the communities are pretty much kind of on the periphery of most kind of civic spaces, and access to them is really kind of, it's complex and it takes some time. But eventually in June of this year, we had an exhibition in the Hugh Lane. And part of the exhibition was a proposal that I made to Pavey Point, the traveller organisation, and to the Hugh Lane, that we would look at works in the Hugh Lane collection that reference traveller culture. As it happens, you know, those works are not made by travellers, but to appear in those works as the subject, I think it's it needs to be kind of fleshed out. We need to kind of look at where those sites are and those where travellers become visible, and to begin to kind of interpret or critique what that visibility is and was. So one of the pieces that the only piece that we could actually transfer from the Hugh Lane collection to Pavey Point's centre was this piece by Jerome Connor called The Street Singer. And to launch it, there was like a traveller singer, and a roundtable discussion. In the Hugh Lane, there was a traveller collection at Hugh Lane, which is what it was called, and these images to the right, some video works. There was music, there was handmade flowers and tin craft objects, and there was portraits from the Mick O'Dea collection, or sorry, the Martin Folan collection, which were painted by Mick O'Dea. There's also the Irish Travelling People's Resource Collection, which was put together by Aileen Lane in the University of Ulster from 1975 to 1998. And the collection, special collection in the University of Ulster is, we borrowed it, digitized it, and made it available online. So these are kind of the processes of trying to identify travellers within those collections and then to try and activate them or mobilize them somehow. But I also wanted to make a reference to, as an artist, another artist's work. This is Andrea Grayer, and her work is called Manifest from 2007. And this work asks, what do we need from museums in this current moment? So in the research that I was doing with Pavy Point and with Traveller Collection, during the workshops, we're asking people to bring in an object and for the communities to discuss that object. Is it heritage item? Is it cultural? Is it active? What relevance does it have? How would it be positioned? If a museum or a collection were to be kind of manifest, how would it be organized and how would these things occur? So in this manifest work, the questions that are being asked are again about trying to imagine the place of the museum in our time. Starting out, so she takes the writings of Grace McCann Morley, who was the founding director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and then she adds contemporary voices to a list of demands, of pleads to the museum, inviting the viewer to imagine alongside her the space of a museum within the current social and political climate and what this could offer to civic society at large. So what we get from this work and these statements that are put forward is a very simple and very complex relationship to the museum. Firstly, access. You need to be able to access the museum. And when you enter these sites of cultural memory and meaning, you need to see yourself reflected back at you. And the third point is that when you see yourself reflected back to yourself, you have to have the power for that representation to turn and face you. So these are the kind of conceptual ideas of how you could position yourself in the museum and how the museum should position itself in relation to the people who visit. So the same questions we were asking to traveller communities and organisers. And this is Martin Collins, who's the co-director of Pavy Point. He described how the particular history of traveller culture, it's not just about documenting and celebrating culture and identity, but it's also about documenting the history and lived experience. And part of that history, if it has to be spelled out, is the ongoing exclusion, marginalization, oppression, persecution, almost a type of a genocide without blood being spilled. Because at the end of the day, you're talking about getting rid of a people for their culture, their history, their identity, and their knowledge. So, I mean, it's a complex relationship between travellers and myself to begin with, but in trying to find spaces where we can discuss or facilitate how a traveller organisation, specifically cultural, specifically looking at these collections, how that might manifest. Again, Martin Collins' comments, he said that I think the fundamental issue is that the community must own the interpretation, the representation, and the management. So, we're trying to recognize where the traveller body exists within the museum and its visibility. So we're kind of asking, what is the relationship to this material? Some of the collections, for example, Harry Clarke, his illustration of James Stevens's Demigods, which was for the Geneva window in 1932, and Jack Butler Yeats's A Tinker from 1905. These are just like two examples of travellers being visible in museums, but the actual relationship to the traveller is very complex and kind of non-existent. And just the José Lanterns, he talks about the thinker trope in literature, and he says, between the creation of Irish literature theatre in 1899, with its nationalist aim of depicting Ireland as a home of the ancient and heroic idealism, and the formation of the Free State in 1922, when that idealism was put severely to the test, the tinker trope underwent a remarkable transformation from being the abstraction onto which Anglo-Irish nationalism projected all their desires and anxieties about the independent nation that was yet to be created, to becoming the embodiment of everything that was objectionable about the Irish past and worrisome about its future. So, when he says everything, I think he means everything. The perceptions of the traveller body, the concept of traveller culture, traveller identity, travellers being Irish. It's fundamentally an issue with Irishness and how it is divided. And just in terms of how travellers might enter a museum or find themselves in the museum, you have to remember there's huge kind of institutional barriers that would prevent this from happening, and there's huge cultural barriers. So, I mean, for example, like in the travelling community, there's 80% unemployment. There's 0.54% of travellers have completed third level. 16% are homeless. In the general population, 2% of travellers, or 2% of people are homeless, which is a huge national crisis, whereas in the travelling community, it's 16%. Suicide is 7 times higher, and life expectancy is between 11 and 15 years less. So these are huge kind of issues around what prevents a traveller from recognising themselves in those collections. Because first of all, they may not have access to those museums. So the project is an ongoing sort of investigation and trying to develop links and earn trust, and to try to facilitate these questions being asked and to establish what might be an appropriate way to proceed. Just in terms of museums, Anthony Camden is the keeper of the Country Life Museum in Mayo, and his analysis was very simple. They begin to address the invisibility or the lack of kind of visibility of travellers in collections. We need to kind of acknowledge that travellers have been marginalised in the collections. So even secondary representations of travellers are problematic in terms of travellers have no relationship to them, or the relationship is a very, very complex one, and without the traveller voice to interpret it, it doesn't bear representation, is what I'm going to say. So this is a piece of work that, as part of the Traveller collection, we invited Rosaline McDonough to write a piece based on an essay by Julie Brazil about Yeats's work on travellers. So Rosaline took Jack B. Yeats's singing "Oh Had I the Wings of a Swallow," and she rewrote like her interpretation. She created an interpretation of it, and the work becomes this kind of dialogue between the subject of the work, being this traveller woman singing on a train, and the painter who is observing this. So she says that the subtlety of the painter's work encapsulates the presence and the inflection of authenticity, However, the problematic legacy of misappropriation, both politically and ethically, brings its own entangled contention. This lies between the artist's settled identity and the traveller of the painting's subject. My agitation remains close. The allegory within Yeats's work concerning travellers can only be understood by way of honouring his intent. So both the artist and the singer become the subject of the painting. The subject and the artist within the museum. So this is the point where we are with this project. I just wanted to present it because I think there are huge problematics around how traveller culture is represented, but looking specifically at culture and engaging with cultural institutions, I think the subject and the artist become the object of the artwork, and that's where I'll leave it.
Much, Seamus. And now I'd like to invite Owen Dara. Owen is an Irish curator based in Scotland, working as head of exhibitions at Dundee Contemporary Arts. At Dundee, he leads the curatorial team in multidisciplinary arts centre, comprising 2 galleries, a 2-screen cinema, and a print production and research studio. Previously worked in Belfast as curator at the MAC and as co-director at Catalyst Arts. He also works collaboratively as 1/5 of the Household Curatorial Collective. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. I thought I'd put this up as an opening, in that this was the short abstract that I sent to Barbara a couple of weeks ago in thinking about what I might present today. And to read it quickly, it says, "A short talk outlining an ongoing attempt to curate within public institutions from an intersectional feminist position, creating space to amplify voices that have been overlooked or underrepresented by dominant culture to date, and collaborating with contemporary artists to actively disrupt the systems of capitalism and patriarchy that control much of the world around us." So, it's only 56 words, which is pretty brief, but it's also one long, quite badly written, never-ending sentence. And within that, it's a bit tiresome, but at the same time, this is the nature of these things, I suppose, where you're trying to squeeze a million different things and thoughts and ideas and emotion into one brief description that will somehow hold everything, and it inevitably doesn't. And especially, it will not, cannot, if the broader subject that we're thinking about today is dissent. Dissent cannot be pinned down, summarized, or easily contained. It ought to be slippery. It ought to be ungraspable and out of reach, able to kind of seep out through the cracks and overflow over vessels that are attempting to hold it in one place. It's complex and it's uncomfortable, and it's a continual process of undoing and reshaping. And with that in mind, that's why I use the words ongoing here, an attempt. I see my work as a curator as a continual process of learning, usually from artists themselves, and learning about, or trying to learn about, the ways in which we can use art to call into question or to rail against some of the dominant and very often oppressive power structures that control much of the world around us. So what I'm just going to do for the next 10 minutes is profile some recent curatorial learning of sorts, to hopefully give a short glimpse into my way of working that I hope then might be useful to discuss further. So I live in Dundee. I'm head of exhibitions at Dundee Contemporary Arts, which is this lovely building here. We're a publicly funded cross-art form centre, and we're really the centre for contemporary art in the city. I've been in the role there for a year and a half and have been working to shift the gallery programme in some ways with our brilliant director, Beth Bate, to make dedicated space for artistic voices that position themselves against the status quo, or that work against normative ways of looking at the world. One of our current projects in the galleries is the first solo show in Scotland by the Spanish artist Santiago Sierra. And Santiago, for 20 odd years now, has been carrying out these hugely provocative actions and projects around the world that do often to kind of seek to challenge hierarchies of power and systems of control that operate in modern society. And this exhibition represents one of his most ambitious undertakings to date. It takes the form, as you'll see, of a photographic and sound installation, the sound you will not see, documenting the process and performance of planting the universal symbol of the anarchist movement, the black flag, at either ends of the earth, at the North and South Pole. And within this performance, within this project, enact a kind of inversion of ownership at either end of the earth, a kind of denial of territory, a refusal of borders and nation states. And arguably, within all of this work, within this act, there is a performance, quite a distilled performance in some ways, of dissent. It's a hugely timely exhibition for a number of reasons, globally but also locally. We've been setting the show in the context of Dundee's own history of polar exploration. And audiences are engaging with this work on so many levels. And perhaps most importantly, it's throwing up, or it seems to be throwing up, many more questions than it is offering up answers. But to briefly come back to my abstract, I said that I'm trying to undertake curatorial work from an intersectional feminist position. And by that, I mean attempting to work at all times, both personally, professionally, and by extension, institutionally, to recognize and call out and actively try and resist a multitude of different repressive or discriminatory frameworks within the patriarchal society that we all still very much live in, that allow misogyny, racism, classism, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia to still thrive in public spaces. And museums and galleries, for me, are public space. In relation to our exhibitions programme, more widely, I suppose, this means swiftly addressing many historical imbalances at DCA in terms of diversity, to commit major resources in the coming years to working, in the first instance, with women, with people of colour, with queer people, with trans and non-binary people, and other artists, voices, artistic communities, and communities in a wider sense that have been overlooked or underrepresented by dominant culture to date. Working in this way means recognising personal and institutional privilege. I am a white male. DCA is a better resourced cultural space than many others in the city, and trying to recognise this privilege to then put it to productive use. Crucially, this means inviting different critical voices into the programme in every single project that we do, and not simply stepping back after an exhibition opens, after opening night, to say, there it is, there's the work, there's the interpretive text, the work is done. And it means opening up space to be challenged institutionally. I mean, in some ways, Santiago has done this in spades already. We literally invited anarchy, or an idea of anarchy, into the building, and have stoked already burning conversations and questions in Dundee around nation states, around independence, around democracy in Scotland and further afield. And with Santiago's project, here was an exhibition, a body of ideas and a body of work that on the surface bears all the markings of dissent and disruption, of trying to upturn easily understood norms relating to borders, relating to territory, landscape, and the natural environment. And this is precisely how we profiled it in DCA. It's how I spoke about it in our interpretation. It's how I spoke about it in our talks and tours when the exhibition opened. But it's not without its contradictions and problems. Santiago knows that himself, and as an artist is very generously and intelligently open to being challenged and criticized. His work itself is rarely comfortable, so why should he be? And if the work is not comfortable, and he is not comfortable, the artist is not comfortable, then why should we be? Why should I be? Why should the institution be? Being productive with privilege means seeking out discomfort. Moments of discomfort are often moments of trying to comprehend something challenging, something new, something complex, and very often means that you can't be complacent. You recognize that you can always be doing better or trying to learn more. And if anyone's interested in that idea of discomfort in a radically productive way, I very much take that from Sarah Schulman's book, The Gentrification of the Mind, which is a remarkable text on the gentrification, really, of the cultural life and lived experience in New York after the AIDS crisis. But with this in mind, with this idea of discomfort, institutional, personal, professional discomfort, I invited the French-Japanese art worker, activist, academic, and writer Nin Yamamoto Mason to enact a kind of live takedown of the project at DCA, to give a performance lecture from her own very politicized position that revealed the ways in which Black Flag unfortunately still folds into certain systems of capitalism and patriarchy that perhaps on the surface it seems to position itself against. For example, the project itself was funded through corporate wealth, through a private individual funding a kind of commissioning art agency called Apolitical. The act of performing and planting these flags was delivered through a tourist industry at the polls that is hugely complicit in the destruction of these lands. The work also still positions the lone male figure as hero and savior in this idea of inversion or dissent. And in being so beautiful in some ways, in being stripped back and sumptuous and these gorgeous black and white photographs and exhibition kind of design, which Nin did not deny the kind of draw of that in the work, it actually flattens or eclipses the gritty reality of this type of endeavor. Also eclipses the violent colonial history of polar exploration and the very real contemporary struggles of indigenous peoples, for example, in these remote landscapes. Nin proposed to us, with us, that Black Flag and the institutional discourses around it operate simply in a realm of fantasy, creating projections that push themselves on top of and over the real struggles of people who have been brutally affected by these kinds of expeditions for centuries. By the end of the performance, she was really arguing that the entire project was actually antithetical to the core beliefs and ideas behind anarchism. And this was in the gallery, this was in our space, this was in public, with the work and with the audience. And from the moment she started speaking, really, my heart was in my mouth, and she really didn't hold back. And she really tore us to shreds in some ways. At one part, she had me read out excerpts of the interpretation that I had written to then interrupt me and challenge or disagree or tell me that I was incorrect or eclipsing or denying X, Y, and Z, which was terrifying to do in public in your own space, to be debunked and to be told otherwise. And within this kind of context, this became a really hugely productive act of live learning in public. She created a space where the institution, the curator, the artist and artwork, the critic, and very importantly, the public, our audiences, citizens, other citizens of Dundee, were all held together, We're all challenged together. We're all made to feel uncomfortable together, and it was fantastic. And I am still very much learning from Neen, and now planning upcoming public programming around future seasons in the building to invite further voices of almost dissenters against perhaps artists that we think are already dissenting. And so basically what I'm perhaps putting out there for wider discussion is the idea that there are always these further layers of dissent to be sought out, to be activated within museums and galleries. And it is up to us as art workers, as directors or curators or artists or critics, to seek them out in order to learn from them, in order to do better. I believe in a wider sense that we need to trust artists, first and foremost, to do the radical, inspiring work that they've been doing for centuries, that they're doing right now, as we've already heard today. And these institutions holding art and culture and ideas and objects need to fit around the ideas and around the artists, not the other way around. We need to collaborate more. We need to throw out lots of multiple, when I say throw out, I mean extend as opposed to dispose of, multiple positions. We need to resist linear narratives and sole authorship. We need to resist single interpretations. We need to invite criticism, active criticism. We need to be held accountable, and we need to be trusting of our audiences as well, and trust in their intelligence and sophistication to grapple with complex ideas and ever-moving kind of ideas. Now I feel in the widest possible sense, beyond the discipline that we're working in, that we need to be polyvocal. We need a cacophony of voices speaking and working together towards better means and better ends from many different positions. We need not all blend in or blend together. We need not all sing off the same hymn sheet, or we need not all sing at all in some ways. Harmony at this stage of the game feels supremely overrated, and I think we need to put more trust back into artists to create collections and projects and histories for our future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. So we have had some varied viewpoints from Amanda has been discussing the methodology behind our process, which examines place, people, and moments of political significance, and the role of art practice in minding the legacy of individuals, ideas, and perspectives of human interaction. Seamus has been discussing a particular ethnic group, the travelling community, the role of the museum, how access is seen, how it is interpreted, and the issues of control, barrier, identity, and representation. And Owen has just finished. I think do not shy away from dissent. Have dissent as the starting point for curatorial practice, and multiple viewpoints that are essential in understanding the complexities of the issues that we're discussing, and also the complexities, indeed, of our own personalities. I imagine in order to rule effectively, the more you can streamline things, the easier it is. And certainly when we were having the centenary of the 1916 Rising, a lot of us museums that were more modern and contemporary without historical collections were challenged as to how we could do this and how we could make it relevant. And of course it was by looking at our contemporary artists, where are we now and how do we look back at what went before, putting back of course all that had been ironed out, all of the all of the different persuasions and religions, all of the vegetarians, the gays, the lesbians, Quakers, the suffragettes, all of the different philosophers and thinkers that had sort of fallen away in an attempt to have a sort of a very narrow main road. And I think that has been hugely successful and has been very much due to the efforts of all the artists. So now I'd like to open it to the floor and to have some questions. Does anybody have a question for the panel? And do we have a mic? I'm sure we do. We have a microphone. Is anybody? Oh, great. There's somebody over here. Yeah, oh, and we should bring the house lights up, please, so we can see people. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. My name's Helen Hartstein, and I'm from the Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery in Exeter. And I just wondered about how do we reconcile the fact that we're trying to represent those people that we say perhaps are underrepresented or don't have a voice, but in a space and through sometimes media that aren't very accessible to some of those people themselves, some of these audiences. So I know that we find it very difficult for kind of a lot of people to feel like they can step into a contemporary art exhibition. So how do we reconcile those two things?
Would you like to start, Owen?
Sure. I would say first and foremost by really owning up to the reality of that, and saying that, because I feel like a lot of museums and galleries at the moment are saying that we're kind of through learning programs and things like that those barriers are being broken down and this, that, and the other. But the reality is that art, in a wider sense, for a lot of people is still terrifying. In my experience, contemporary art is right up there in terms of being a difficult subject to enter into. I suppose if I'm only speaking in terms of my institution, one way that we do that in DCA is to try and make sure that audiences are using the building in lots of different ways and get to know the building through the way in which that we kind of shape it. So alongside the exhibition program in the galleries, we have 2 cinemas, we have a print studio, we have a restaurant, bar, and then we have a learning program that sits across the whole organisation. And one of the loveliest ways of cross-pollinating audiences in that sense is trying to get people who are coming into the cinema. If I'm working with a video artist, for example, or a film artist, which we typically are often enough, that we talk to people in the cinemas beforehand about the differences in what they will see in a black box space of a cinema versus what they might see with film or moving image if they just take a look upstairs after the screening or whatever, and try and shift things differently there. Also, this is maybe not that helpful and very specific, but it was a remarkable shift. Whenever I started, just before I started last year, there were always temporary walls built just on the inside doors of both of our galleries that kind of sealed them off and blocked out a bit of noise and blocked out, the kind of cacophony of the building itself to create that white cube, sacred chapel to art. And we took them down straight away, and that physical act of just opening the gallery door and making that threshold between the public spaces, the restaurant and the bar, and a space where you might see art much muddier, really did a great deal.
Have you, Amanda, what would you think?
I do. Invite artists to come in and give them time to work. Artists will research, they will consider, artists can bridge the gap, and by what I mean by time, there is no quick fix and there is no quick answer to this. Institutions are complex, and there are many people in many positions who have many personal agendas as well as public agendas, but artists can negotiate and move where other people can't. They have no agendas. And when you set, apart from representation of the body of people that you wish to come in, that you've targeted for the artist to look at, and give them freedom. If you write a brief, write a good brief, but allow them to grow within the brief. When I was given the brief to work with the LGBT community in County Galway, older can't go away. So this was a doubly invisible community. They're old and they're gay. So I was given a year, and I needed actually 3. I met Christine at the end. So think about 3-year briefs. Think about 5 years.
It's the longevity of a project rather than a very short term. Because if you, Seamus, would you like to add to that? Like the process is part of the process, also is part of the whole. If you're talking about an exhibition, the process, the thinking behind it, the actual doing of it, and even the feedback afterwards. It's all part of the artistic endeavour.
Yeah, absolutely. Just echo those points made, but I also think that the the artists and the museums have the ability to not operate just in the museum. To extend beyond those boundaries. I mean, it is great, like, to muddy the waters or to have the time to consider and to develop and bridge those gaps. But it's also like the people, the communities that you're engaging with are simply people, and it's generally about trust and about bringing the museum somehow to those people. So, like, I think that the museum is strong enough to be able to do that. I think, people believe in the museum, and it's the repository for our memory, our cultural meanings and stuff, and it's kind of unshakable in a lot of ways. So it can be challenged, it can be pushed and stretched, and I think it can, enter communities in a way that should be as imaginative as curators and artists are being within museums and galleries.
So to have a bridge between the community and the more static structure, which is the museum. Would anybody else like to comment, or do we have another question? Over there. Anybody? We talk about the complexity of the museum, and for those of us who run museums and who manage museums, we do, I suppose, have our own ways of negotiating both through the artists and our communities. And you did mention, Seamus, barriers there and representation. Do you feel that the museums have improved this notion of, you step into a hallowed place and this is for a certain type of person? Has that improved, do you think, in the identity of museums and museum curation?
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of improving. I mean, I think it's simply, it has to reflect the people who use it. Of course, you can get better at that, but when I was talking about Anthony Condon's his essay on dissolving the boundaries of the museum, it's not necessarily important to redress those things. Because redress is not really how you build something new. If something is missing, maybe it needs to be there, but to be there just by redress is a kind of maybe a tokenist sort of gesture. So I think that the museum has to be as open to fail as the artist and the artwork is.
Yeah. Because I think it's never really a fail, isn't it? It's always an experiment. And certainly, perhaps to answer that also is the type of curation and the type of programs have then, as you say, representation rather than we must be better. You actually have, as Owen said, Dissent as a starting point and have multiple viewpoints. So the programs in the museum that come into the museum should be programs from different sectors, from different communities, and that they all have a parity, as you were saying, Amanda, parity, but when they all have different viewpoints, there will be different responses and different reactions. And we, as curators and museum people, should be open and ready for that. And I think that's the great thing. We never actually make a huge mistake. It's actually, that one didn't really work, but let's try it this way. And I think that is recognized as very important in our field.
I think it also, the idea, I think creating space for failure or for things not to work out in institutions, it makes them human as well. it opens it up in such a way that people that perhaps would have always seen that organisation or that building or that space as something impenetrable, to see that they can make mistakes in, as I was saying, in a live way, and acknowledge them, bring it into their ideas of how they're articulating their projects, and learn from them in public, be public and open about those things. It makes us all more human, and therefore more easily to relate to.
And just to maybe to answer a question that came up in a previous session, and it was about this fear of a certain demographic of audience, that there would seem to be a fear of inviting this audience into institutions. And having worked personally with individuals who would have imparted fear upon society, paramilitary organisation individuals, everybody is human. There is always the way to make a human contact with an individual, and artists are very good at bringing it down to that human contact of how you do that.
Yeah, and it's very difficult, really, if you go about a project with research and a genuine goal of participation and representation and listening. It's very difficult, actually, to fail. You may not get the statistics you want, like how many people came in, what was that. But I sometimes think even if you get 3 people that have actually been engaged in something, that certainly is in itself a success, mightn't be overall success. I think our time is, I notice lights moving a little, I think our time is up. Thank you very much for coming to this session. I'd like to again thank artist Amanda Dunsmore and Seamus Nolan and curator Owen Dara, and thank you very much for listening to us this afternoon.
to this session, this late afternoon session. My name is Debbie Lyle. I'm a professor of international politics at Queen's University here in Belfast. And I've published some work on how contested histories are made visible in museum spaces, mostly around questions of war and conflict. And I had the great pleasure and the great honor to be a member of the academic advisory group that helped to shape the new Troubles and Beyond exhibition at the Ulster Museum. And for those of you who don't know, that was where you were partying last night. That's where the exhibition is. This session this afternoon uses the National Museum Northern Ireland's experience of curating the Troubles and its legacy as a kind of case study. And in general, we wanted to consider how museums can work with key stakeholders to sensitively and responsibly curate dissent. And that's especially the case with respect to contested histories. So part of the questions that we're trying to ask on this panel are around providing honest reflections about both the practicalities, actually, and the challenges of curating difficult or contested histories in museum spaces. We wanted to consider the ethical obligations of museums when working with victims and survivors of conflict. And we wanted to enable museum professionals to hear directly from external partners about their expectations, their experiences, and recommendations when working with museums, again, in that space where we're trying to represent contested histories. So I'm delighted to be here today and to be a part of this panel. I'm going to introduce you to the speakers, and then they're going to go, it's their preference to go one after another, and we've decided to stay safely in this nice safe space of the table, as opposed to the podium. So directly to my left here is Karen Logan. Karen is the curator of history with National Museums Northern Ireland and the project curator of Collecting the Troubles and Beyond, which is expressed in the exhibition that you saw last night when you were partying. After years of research and consultation and collection development, the Ulster Museum's new Troubles and Beyond gallery opened to the public on the 30th of March, 2018. It powerfully examines our recent past through a remarkable range of objects that reflect the diverse perspectives and experiences of those who lived through the Troubles and are still living with it. And Karen is going to discuss the curatorship of this gallery and the approaches that were taken by the National Museums Northern Ireland in curating dissent responsibly. Beside Karen is Damien McNally. Damien works in association with Wave Trauma Centre, which provides care and support for people affected by the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And Damien was one of the sitters for Colin Davidson's Silent Testimony exhibition at the Ulster Museum, which reveals the stories of 18 people who are connected by their individual experiences of loss through the Troubles. Based on that experience, he seeks to continue the conversation, but advocates for the development of a different narrative around the Troubles, one that depoliticizes it, and as he'll talk about, aligned with ideas of grief theory, one that opens up a wider conversation, but in a sensitive and an ethical way. Beside Damien is Brian Young, and Brian was a member of the punk band Rudy, which formed in 1975, and he continues to perform as the lead vocalist of the Saberjets. Rudy's classic hit, Big Time, was the first release on Belfast's famous Good Vibrations label, and the band performed alongside the Outcasts, Roofrex, the Undertones, and many more. Belfast punk scene, a vibrant manifestation of a broader UK subculture, constructed an alternative space that frequently challenged local sectarian identities. And with this direct experience, Brian can offer us an insight into the punk ethos, his experience of dissent within the context of the Troubles, and how he feels that the Ulster Museum has represented those aspects of our recent past. So we're going to go one after another, and then we will open it up to all of you for some questions. So Karen, if you want to get started.
Okay, thank you. So the theme of our session is Dissent Without Desensitization, and I'm going to speak a bit about curating the Troubles and Beyond. This photograph shows the previous Troubles gallery at the Ulster Museum, which had remained unchanged since it opened in 2009, following a period of refurbishment at the museum. And as you can see from the photograph, it's purely black and white images and text. There are no artifacts in that exhibition. It's very much the way that you would have seen the Troubles presented in the media through the lens of a photojournalist. And obviously the impact of the gallery was limited by that absence of original artifacts and alternative perspectives. So even at the time of opening, press reports of the gallery described it as bland, safe, and strenuously non-controversial, the past defeating the present for fear of giving offence or causing controversy. So in 2015, we made a successful application to the Heritage Lottery Fund to address the limitations of the gallery through the Collecting Cultures programme. So there are obvious challenges in curating difficult and contested history. The traumatic events of the years after 1968 touched almost everyone who lived here and many others from further afield. Inevitably, the interpretation of these events is contested in terms of significance, meaning, and responsibility. While we have a shared past, we do not have a shared memory. And you can see here in the images on this slide 2 posters from our collection that communicate very different perspectives on the UDR, the Ulster Defence Regiment. And the photograph on the bottom left shows a young girl who's just learned that her father has been killed, and it's very representative of the human impact that we need to remain mindful of. So in terms of balance, very deliberately in inverted commas, people often ask how we ensure balance is achieved, but that implies some sort of equilibrium between 2 sides. The reality is much more complex and involves diverse perspectives. The visitor is presented with a curated selection of objects and a range of perspectives, including individual testimonies, and must draw together their own interpretation. Our approach is intended to challenge ideas, debunk myths, and demonstrate the integrative complexity of the conflict. By interpreting diverse perspectives in context, alongside original artifacts and information drawn from scholarship, it is hoped that visitors gain a greater understanding of the history of Northern Ireland and how those different narratives intersect. It is much more about editorial integrity and taking a critical approach that does not try to resolve the violence of the Troubles and its impact, but promotes dialogue and understanding. And that's where our responsibility lies in relation to dissent without desensitisation. So the gallery was redeveloped in phases. This has been a long process over the last couple of years. And some of the initial comments that we received, you can see on the screen here. The majority of the responses were constructive, but these comments were being made. There's no doubt that this is a divisive period of our history. There are some that oppose the very fact that we are bringing together these alternative perspectives. But to tell one part of the story and exclude another would limit the potential for peace building. So our aim was not to achieve consensus, but encourage narrative hospitality. There are a number of significant challenges in ensuring the ethical representation of a conflict which claimed thousands of lives. From the outset of the project, a strong ethical framework was established, guided by the principles of ethical remembering, those outlined by the Community Relations Council and the MA's Code of Ethics. There's a significant duty of care to victims and survivors when working in this area. The photograph you can see here on the slide is a photograph of Patrick Rooney, the first child to be killed during the Troubles, and his brother was one of those who came forward to share their experiences. At first, he was quite challenging of the museum's approach, but we worked with him and were able to share his story in the gallery. And he went on to say that, "I hope this project gets people to reflect and think, was it really all worth it?" Having said that, there's also the risk that placing an emphasis on the trauma of events results in personalization, psychologizing, and the production of emotion, which can make it difficult to interpret and understand the underlying factors more comprehensively. There are different perceptions that exist, interpretations, and the museum should be able to present this pluralism without bias, yet to assimilate all possible points of view can limit the audience's capacity to be critical or subversive. There are inherent risks in presenting memory and reflective opinion. The subjectivity can destabilize the narrative, and it can be as much about forgetting and self-censoring. That said, the power of individual perspectives and personal responses is in evoking a recognitive response from the audience based on personal truth. So our decision was to present broader narratives counterpoised with individual voices, introducing a degree of criticality and subversion while maintaining inclusivity. And this is in the photograph, a feature you can see where people have contributed their own stories and their own words, and that's where Patrick's brother's story is displayed as well. So the collecting activity and interpretive planning focused on wider social, cultural, and economic themes, not just exclusively on conflict and politics, which enabled a much more nuanced and inclusive engagement with this complex period of history. And also the timeline of the new gallery does not end with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, but extends to the present day. And this inclusion of material relating to post-conflict Northern Ireland enables greater exploration of continuity and change within local society. So we've included objects around Brexit, issues of identity, flag protests, campaign for equal marriage, all very contemporary issues here. So after a long period of research, consultation and engagement and collection development, the Troubles and Beyond exhibition opened at the end of March to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And the same journalist who had made the comments I quoted at the start of the presentation went on to say that this has been a brave move, and while it is a difficult process, it's a necessary step forward. The response has been really positive and constructive, and there's some more examples of the comments we've received here, which I'll let you read for yourselves, but just to point out a few that sort of struck me. The top right there, this person is saying that they weren't directly affected by the Troubles, though they knew people who died and know the sound of gunfire and bombs, which is quite directly affected in my mind. And the other one, just below that, the gallery made me feel uncomfortable. Have I done nothing to change things? That sense of personal responsibility that somebody has come away with having seen the exhibition. We've also had comments, second one down on the left, about use of language. And there was a lot of discussion around that with our academic advisory group, but there are still issues around even the term of the Troubles, whether somebody was killed or murdered, whether it's conflict or terrorism. These sort of discussions continue. And another one there about how their view came from their education and raising, how segregated and biased they were. So it's really interesting to have these different perspectives. Another one saying that they're proud of the Ulster Museum, that we're not afraid to do this, and we used to be so cautious. So there's a real range of perspectives, but at the same time, people vary so much in where they are in their personal journey. And one of the questions that we ask in our feedback form is if anybody has a story that they would like to share. And so far, more than one person has simply written not yet. So it's very much a journey that is ongoing and a continuing process. So the final slide, just to say that that conversation continues, and we'll continue to feed that back into the exhibition.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Damien, yeah.
Okay, I hope you can hear me okay, and I hope you're not blinded by my head here, but anyway, get on with it. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you today. I hope these slides come up here, but really just wanted to talk to you about the experience of Colin Davis's silent testimony. I'm really wanting to talk about trying to realise the potential of that exhibition. I suppose if you're not really aware of it, it was basically Colin painted 18 people who were affected in different ways by the Troubles, and he tried to do that where he represented everybody, so people affected by loyalist or Republican violence, state violence, and also those affected by it from the Republic of Ireland and over in England. So really what Colin was wanting to do with that exhibition, Colin here talks about his initial inspiration being the Good Friday Agreement and saying that it really had very little to offer, really kind of people who'd be termed as victims or what they had lost. So he wanted to document that, and he felt that the whole area of victims and survivors had been politicised in this place over the last 20 years, really since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And he wanted to look at the human suffering rather than Protestant suffering or Catholic suffering. So really what Colin wanted to do was just put a face to those people sometimes who were affected, and his paintings say very, very little about, just tell you who the person is and how they were affected, but it says nothing else about it, really, who was responsible and that sort of thing. So for me, his Dissent is saying that he wants to look at the human suffering as opposed to Protestant or Catholic suffering, and that's what I would think I'd like to talk about whenever I'm talking about Dissent today. That's what I'm talking about, a focus on human suffering. So it's not about Protestants, Catholics. We can't get away from that, and I understand that. But I think that places like museums can provide that space to continue the conversation that Colin has started with his exhibition. Now, the exhibition was here in the Ulster Museum in 2015, and then it was here for a couple of weeks to mark the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. The exhibition's been over in Paris, it's been over down in Dublin, it's been over in the United Nations building there a couple of weeks ago, so it'll move somewhere else. But I think that's great, and that's a conversation starter, but it's something that we can continue on, probably back here at home, and using spaces like as museums to continue the conversation. And this is particularly important at the minute when we don't have any kind of, there's unlikely to be a political settlement here and political agreement on how to deal with the legacy of the past, and we're going to wait, and while Brexit's on the horizon, things are unlikely to improve here politically. So again, this is me saying how museums can maybe carry on a conversation that's been started by people like Colin Davidson and others. So I'm just showing you some of the paintings from Colin Davidson's exhibition. There's 16 of the 18 here, okay, so this is the only picture I could find that had as many on it that you could actually see. So there's 16 of the 18 people, and I just wanted to say something about 2 of the people who aren't on that 16. They're just, again, some of you are familiar with the exhibition and some aren't. So this first person is Margaret Yeaman, and Margaret was injured in a bomb explosion in Banbridge in 1982. And this is basically the first exhibition or the first place that Margaret has ever been seen or photographed without wearing her glasses. And obviously Margaret was blinded in that bomb. So again, that's an example of somebody who has been injured as a result of the Troubles here. Again, as you'll see from the descriptions, it really doesn't say much else about who did it. It's just Margaret and what has happened to her. And another person there is Maureen Reid. Maureen's husband was killed in 1976, and she had 10 children, so she had to raise 10 children on her own. And Maureen, unfortunately, has since died. That painting was taken. So again, it really lets people see the kind of the urgency behind a lot of this. That it's paintings of people who are no longer with us, unfortunately, and their suffering goes on. And Colin has caught that very well, captured it very well. Again, Thomas O'Brien. Again, it's just to give the southern dimension. Thomas's brother and his sister-in-law and both of their children were killed in the Dublin bomb in 1974. So again, Colin, Wave, and everybody involved just wanted to be able to represent those who were affected by the Troubles, really, in the south. And then another example is Mumu Norton, whose brother was killed in a bomb explosion in England. Again, it's providing an example of the wider impact of the Troubles here. Now, you have me, Scary, here, Ming the Merciless here, whatever you want to call me, but this is basically me. My father was killed in 1976 when I was 4 months old. And there you have it. And this is a picture of my dad, Paul. And this picture was taken in 1968. Now, why I've chosen this picture is him and his motorbike. I think they were about 18 at that time, so God knows what they were up to or what they were doing. Clearly no health and safety back then, helmets or nothing. But it's really, look, if you look at this building behind him, it used to be a grocer's. So this is 50 years ago, and you see 2 roofs. There's actually another roof behind that. So that's that building there today, 2018. So not much has changed. It's turned into a library. So this is basically an interface area in Belfast. This is really the interface between Ardoyne and really moving on behind that library into more the kind of Protestant area of the town and moving on more into the Shankill area. And if you're looking at Google Maps here and you turn to your left, this is what you'll see here. So this is a roundabout here, and over the last number of years in Belfast, there's been this has basically had been a sectarian flashpoint, but there's a lot of rioting going on here. So you have one community in the green here. So these buildings here on your left behind the green arrow is the Ardoyne area where my father was from and where we were from. And then the orange arrow signifies the Protestant communities over in the Shankill. And really this is the interface where they came together. And over the last number of years there's been a contentious parade coming down this road and been a lot of rioting and that sort of thing. But what I was just wanting to emphasize is just behind that green arrow over there is the corner of the street where that's where my father was shot and killed. He died, he shot on a Saturday and he died on a Monday. And it's to say that because of these narratives between these 2 communities, this community of Ardoyne and the Shankill here, so the people from the Shankill came over, just basically my father was the first person he saw and thought, right, well, this is going to be a Catholic, so we'll shoot them. And obviously people from Ardoyne behind the green arrow are those who were involved in the Shankill bomb, so people from that area went over into the Shankill and killed people who were just going about their ordinary everyday business. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that just the stories of these people, these just normal people getting on with their lives, gets lost within the kind of very polarized narratives about what happened in Northern Ireland. And I was just really trying to give you an example of what example of one case where that happened. So this is really Ardoyne, as you would see it now. This is the same road, and this is where this is some of the protests around the parade that was coming down the road. As you look at it, it actually looks like the police are beating each other up there, but they're actually fighting with rioters there. And then you'll see another example there of the police presence on that road. If you see just that kind of greeny building there behind, that's the library I talked about earlier on there. So you see that at certain times of the year, and obviously during the Troubles, this was a major flashpoint. Okay, so again, These are areas with very kind of difficult political issues to deal with, but it's the people behind them whose stories ultimately get lost within these kind of political narratives and the political arguments around the whole thing. But that's just one example from Belfast. Again, it's just really trying to set it in perspective in terms of the numbers. You know, this is the status of people killed in the Troubles, and it's really just to say, look, this is from the Lost Lives book that came out, just documenting the stories of all those killed, that 56% of people were civilians. And I would have to say that from my perspective, a lot of stories of those civilians are the ones that don't get told. Everybody has a right. Everybody, well, security forces, Republicans and loyalists have all the right, have the right to have their story told. But again, it's just getting a bit of balance in there, because the stories of these individuals get lost, and these kind of statistics get lost behind the whole thing. So I'm sorry to kill you with a couple of PowerPoint slides as we finish here, but what I'm saying is I understand that we can't depoliticize what happened here in Northern Ireland, okay? There's strong community voices, political voices, and community narratives, and there's no political agreement at the minute on how to deal with the past. So when there's no political agreement, all progress seems to stop. And I think that's really important, where museums can step into that gap, into that kind of that silence. Everybody's kind of sitting back now, waiting to see what happens with whether there'll be another storm, whether there'll be a fresh start agreement, what will happen after Brexit. So because of all these things happen, doesn't make us less likely to deal with these kind of issues. And one particular issue I particularly would get particularly vexed about would be when people have been murdered. It can be termed very easily as war and conflict, you know. And one of the things I would have heard quite regularly was, you know, your dad mustn't have been killed for nothing. He wouldn't have just been shot for no reason. When actually he was. He was out doing his normal, engaged in his normal business. Wasn't involved in anything. And we maybe need to look at this just world hypothesis, you know, that states that people feel a need to believe that their environment is a just and orderly place where people usually get what they deserve. So that's almost a way of kind of people justifying in their own heads, well, that was the Troubles, it must have been involved in something. We'll kind of stay away from it. And I can understand why people do, because it's so heavily politicized. But it's something that we need to look at, you know, this whole thing of no smoke without fire, you know, victim blaming and that sort of thing. So again, a museum is a place where you maybe we can address some of these issues. Okay, so really we're asking, why do we still live with the legacy of the past and all that? What is it? And we need to kind of talk about, use a context and a framework of just talking about grief. It's not all about politics, it's just about people are living through, and why does it seem to go on for years and years? And there's basically two people from the kind of grief literature field I'd like to briefly talk about. One would be Pauline Boss, who's really kind of coined this phrase around ambiguous loss, and that talks about loss where there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of unanswered questions. She did a lot of work with families after 9/11, basically where bodies weren't found, where people had a lot of questions about how their loved one died. So when people in Northern Ireland and other conflict zones don't get kind of justice or don't get questions answered, they can't grieve properly. The grief process becomes frozen. And then another aspect is disenfranchised grief, and this is a person called Kenneth Doka, who talks about this, how because of the characteristics of people and their experiences, a lot of their grief isn't acknowledged by other people. So I've written some work about young people in Northern Ireland and how their kind of grief wasn't listened to either during the Troubles or now, whenever they want to find out a bit more. You also talk about those living with injury, particularly the injured in Northern Ireland, who don't show up really. You know, there's some statistics around it, but nobody really, they've no kind of access to justice and that sort of thing. So again, these are just a couple of examples why you would say, why doesn't this just go away? You know, it's so long ago, why can't we just deal with this? It's because there's so many unanswered questions, and the way political things are set up here, people aren't likely to get those answers. Okay, so I'll not go through all of those. But what I would say, it would be probably helpful for a space like a museum and others to say, okay, what are the commonalities of this, what people have gone through here? How do we look at, people haven't got answers to their questions, and that's fair enough, but there's other examples and scenarios where people haven't got answers to questions about how a loved one died or whatever else has happened. So I've used some of those examples, like the historical institutional abuse that's currently ongoing, and it may be signed off at the minute by the civil service, but that's all in the air at the minute. So people have lots of questions about what happened there. People over in Hillsborough, the Hillsborough disaster, they had an awful lot of unanswered questions about how loved ones died, and there was victim blaming went on about blaming Liverpool fans about what happened. The Grenfell Tower, people asking questions about why there was, people had concerns around the building at the time, so why wasn't that dealt with? The Stardust disaster in Dublin, where I think it was 48 young people were killed in that, and again unanswered questions about how a fire started, and then trying to blame, well, it was kind of a bit of controversy around blaming the young people involved in that somebody set it on fire as opposed to an electrical fault. The tomb bodies, issue around unanswered questions about what happened there. Manchester Arena, the current issue around London knife crime and how kind of, be careful not to write people and communities off. And the whole issue around last days around suicide, the stigma around that, and hopefully that stigma is disappearing to a certain extent. But again, it's the whole issue around unanswered questions. So what I would really like, I think museums would be a good place to look at the common features of dealing with the legacy of the Troubles, but then how that relates to other significant events and issues. That's all I could say. Thank you.
Brian?
Right. I'm here to talk about punk rock in the late 70s in Belfast, so that's probably a bit of light relief. For those of you under 50, which is probably more of you out there than us up here, sorry, punk rock, I suppose, first raised its head amongst the scenesters in downtown New York in the mid-70s as a coterie of ex-glam rockers, failed artists, junkies and poets ditched their glitter threads, adopting a back-to-basics approach as a reaction to the boring excesses of AOR and prog rock. By far the most influential of this bunch were the Ramones, who mixed 50s rock and roll, 60s bubblegum, and their very own mondo minimalism to create a unique new sound unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. Their first album came out early in 1976, and thanks to the UK rock press and the likes of John Peel, was snapped up by those teenagers who were bored stupid with the lame disco music and dross that clogged up the charts and were looking for something new to call their own. I got one of the first US import copies of the album in Caroline Music here in Belfast, and it turned my world upside down overnight, hammering home the eternal truth that you don't have to be able to play 17 chords or be a musical virtuoso to write great songs, and that if you couldn't say everything you wanted to in a 3-minute single, then it wasn't worth saying in the first place. Closer to home in London, would-be Svengalis Malcolm McLaren and Bernie Rhodes ripped off Richard Hale's spiky haircut and torn t-shirt, adding in the Dolls' bad attitude and some half-baked situationist hippie slogans, coming up with something more relevant to this side of the pond. And it wasn't long before I started to hear about these new London punk rock bands with thought-provoking names such as the Sex Pistols, the Damned and the Clash. Ironically, if one place on earth was primed and ready for punk, it was Belfast. And when punk finally reached here, it hit harder and lasted longer than anywhere else. By necessity, it was DIY all the way, kick-started by a handful of semi-delinquent and disgruntled teens who were pissed off with the status quo, and the band status quo too, and had the grit, spunk and determination to go out and do something about it. There were no punk Svengalis, record labels, haberdashers or trendy boutiques over here, so while others roared with laughter, a nation of spotty teenagers hacked and chopped away at their hair and clothes to get that snappy new look down just right. I still laugh when I recall the furore one punkette inspired in the local press by turning up for a cancelled Clash gig using a kettle for a handbag. The existing music industry was dead on its feet here, monopolised on one side by 60s throwback showband mafia, and on the other by a weird conglomeration of ageing hippies who all claimed to have been in the band with Van Morrison at one time. None of their few remaining venues would let us darken their doors, so we booked function rooms in notorious East Belfast dives like the Glenmackin and Girton Lodge, holding private parties which we then played at, packing them out with hundreds of underage teenagers just looking for a good time and escape from what was going on around them. For a very long time, Rudy, the band I was in, were the only local combo remotely resembling a punk band, and it wasn't until late 1977 that others followed suit. But unlike the American and UK prime movers, most all of the bands here were still teenagers, and almost without exception, it was the first time they'd ever set foot on a stage. Amazingly, whilst ambition often exceeded ability, these new bands knocked out a pretty impressive racket, displaying a diversity and instinctive knack of knocking out killer material that belied their tender years. Paradoxically, though, on the surface, we may have embraced the studied nihilism and desire to shock and outrage from UK punk. The impact of punk here was resolutely positive, though most definitely more by accident than design. Once city centre venues like the Harp Bar were established, again by local teenagers initially, people were able to venture outside their own areas, meeting up with their contemporaries from the other side of the divide for possibly the first time ever, and transcending the existing barriers of class and religion. For sure, not every spiky top was non-sectarian, but generally what was most important was the band you liked, not what foot you kicked with. You were punk first and everything else was secondary. People realised instinctively too that they had much more in common with their supposed enemies on the other side than they had with many of their neighbours. This wouldn't have been big news in London, Manchester or New York, but in Belfast it was quite literally life-changing. And once the genie's out of the bottle, he's not going back in. And so punk was a positive force here, bringing people together, making a real difference to individual lives and perceptions, and providing an opportunity and impetus to look at things in a new light. But that's if you wanted to. So while it didn't change the world, it certainly did change my world and open my eyes and made me at least think differently about a lot of things I'd previously taken for granted. And I wasn't the only one. But getting back to the subject in hand, Dissent, because that's, I suppose, what we're here for, wasn't really something that most teenage punk rockers here would have concerned themselves overly about back in the day. But it's true that Dissent plays an integral role in any youth movement, even if it's only down to shocking the general public with some spiffy threads or a preposterous haircut. Punk was different from previous youth movements in that questioning, rejecting and destroying was the status quo, which is almost a textbook definition of dissent, and that was its initial raison d'etre. Initially too, punk attracted the misfits, the loners and the oddballs, welcoming and celebrating diversity in all its forms. Again, this was an organic and accidental process, and it was an unexpected irony that such a nihilistic and superficially destructive movement would have such a positive impact on the ground. It can certainly be argued that folks like Malcolm McLaren and Bernie Rhodes only used punk as a marketing ploy to sell overpriced bondage, strides and t-shirts, but the impact here was much more far-reaching and positive, especially as the significance of the DIY ethic embodied by the remarkable rise of the independent record labels associated with punk came to the fore. Paradoxically too, while dissent is often linked to a political ideology, it's perhaps worth commenting that punk here, during the period I was involved, sort of 76 to 81, remained largely apolitical, as being seen to support or be aligned with an established political viewpoint or party here would automatically link you forever to one side only. It was for that very reason that an attempt to establish a Rock Against Sectarianism organisation here floundered in 1978. Punks realised instinctively not only what united, but what also divided them too. That's a history lesson over. The Troubles and Beyond exhibition, I've donated some old posters and tickets and whatever else too. And Karen had asked me my opinion of the exhibition. And it's just really like to reflect, when I was growing up, museums always played it safe. You've got saber-toothed tigers, mummies, and always the Romans. But even when I was in school, our history lessons avoided any contentious periods, and there was never an attempt made to address any contemporary issues. And here in Northern Ireland, where people still travel long distances to be offended, I suppose that's understandable, especially where public money's involved. Even though we have a shared history, many of the general public still want museums to reflect only their perception of history and to reinforce their beliefs and prejudices. And the last thing they want to see is an exhibition celebrating, or worse still, justifying the other side. So to my way of thinking, it's brave to see the Troubles and Beyond Gallery and the Ulster Museum attempt to reflect a shared history without trying to take sides or pass any moral judgment. So while you have the expected loyalist and Republican displays, you also have other exhibits that reflect the impact events here had on the ordinary public. And by presenting personalised accounts of individual experiences, it brings home the fact that every statistic in the Troubles, regardless of their circumstances, was a living, breathing human being with a unique story of their own. It's important too to remember that throughout those years, many people never fitted neatly into or rejected the simplistic orange-green confines. And I guess that's where punk comes in, as it enabled many young people to take on a new identity, even if only temporarily, free from those very constraints. It's early days yet, but I'd like to see less concentration on the bands and the music, as frankly that was often the most boring part of punk, and see more fanzines and printed material alongside contemporary photographs and accounts of the impact punk had on individual people's lives. Much more inspiring than a bunch of scratchy old 45s or Greg Cowan's ridiculous leather jumpers. Also, I'd like to see material relating to the anarcho-punk scene here of the mid-80s and beyond, even if just for balance. I do remain wary of some of the more fanciful claims about punk did or didn't achieve here in Belfast, as there's a definite rose-tinted nostalgia and revisionism of sorts at work, which has no place in punk as I remember it. Historically too, it's readily apparent that so many of the more popular punk acts were aging never-has-beens who'd been traipsing unsuccessfully around the gig circuit for years and who realised that a quick haircut and change of image was their ticket to the big time. And the blunt truth, like it or not, is that any punk band who ever signed to a major was no different from the Bay City Rollers or any other manufactured pop act or image. But it didn't mean they didn't make some great records. But then punk wasn't perfect. Despite that, I'm still fond of and fiercely proud of my punk years, though I'm more than a bit apprehensive at being seen as a museum piece. I gotta admit, and finishing up here too, it's kind of depressing to look at the various orange-green photos and exhibits from events I remember from my teenage years and realise that 40 years on, nothing seems to have changed. In fact, if I'm honest, right now, things seem to be moving backwards. So I guess that's why it's good to see punk in there too, even if it's just to remind people that there's always an alternative. Though whether today's apathetic younger generation can drag themselves away from their 24-hour-a-day anti-social media and must-have devices for long enough to do anything about it is another matter. That's me.
Thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Can we get the house lights up so that you guys can see everybody out there? Is that possible? And I think there's a microphone. There should be a microphone somewhere, or I can run down with that one. There we go. Lights are up. So does anybody have questions for any of the speakers? It's better. Oh, there we go. Bye.
Hello, is it on? Oh,
yes.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. One of the things that's, I guess, kind of become clear is that when there is an absence of the sort of state-imposed truth and reconciliation type movement that South Africa had, that other groups kind of fill the gaps, and that those groups tend to be bottom up. You know, they tend to be community groups, they tend to be smaller museums or larger museums, or within the cultural sector or within other areas, the creative sectors. Do you think that that now is the only way to kind of go forward, to bridge any of these gaps, to bring people together? Or is there a sense that we're still waiting for some kind of bigger process to take place that will help with this effort to come to some agreement about what the truth of the past is and move on?
I suppose in terms of truth recovery, it's quite difficult, and as Damien was saying, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and there'll probably always be a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of work here in terms of there was a public consultation recently on how to address the legacy of the past, and a lot of work being done on the ground in relation to that. I suppose in terms of the museum, what I would hope we could do is begin to build understanding. So maybe people don't necessarily recover the truth and facts of details of what happened, but begin to understand a bit more where alternative perspectives were coming from, and how maybe certain sets of circumstances evolved in the context in which they evolved.
I think it's probably just good to have a mix. I think there was a radio program by Mark Rullers on last week. I can't remember if they called it Dark Tourism, but it's talking about a lot of work that loyalists and Republicans are doing, kind of setting up Roman kind of community museums and that sort of thing. So, you know, I've absolutely no issue with that. I think everybody has their narratives to tell, but I think places maybe like the museum and other spaces could provide a bit of a balance to that, and provide a space where maybe people who don't feel comfortable, who don't feel overly political, can maybe feel they can have a space to engage in the conversation as well. That it's not just I don't want it to be in that it's only kind of victims, and I don't like that term either, or feel they're the only ones that have anything to say about what happened in Northern Ireland over the last 50 years. Everybody was living in it. So I think places like museums can provide, and particularly the Ulster Museum and others can provide that kind of space to enable them to have a bit of freer expression, to talk about what they lived through.
Brian, did you come in?
I just think over here you have to get away from the same old orange and green stuff, and how you do that, I don't know. That's the difficulty with any museum, is that people just go to reinforce their own prejudices. If you can get something, I don't know, because you're dealing with a difficult and contentious subject, how do you explain to somebody who has already got their mind made up about something that there's another perspective? And I suppose where you can see the two main narratives side by side, even if it takes a while, maybe it gives them then, maybe they realise, well, like, there's other people's opinions. But again, it's Northern Ireland, and the way things are here at the minute, it's not going to change anytime soon, I don't think.
I think the other question around, following on from Brian, was about the question of audience. And in the discussions that we were having over the exhibition, there was a lot of tension around how the local audiences would relate to the exhibition, and there's a lot of sensitivities around that. But then there were questions around, well, now there are a lot more people coming into Belfast and they don't know anything about the Troubles, so how do you also provide information about what happened, put that in quotes, right, what happened, but then also be sensitive to the local context about when you tell the story about what happened, it's not as simple as just listing facts. So there were some really interesting and quite contentious understandings around how you speak to those multiple audiences. Is there other questions in the audience? There's one down here. Can we, here, she's coming here.
Hi there. I work for a Holocaust survivors charity based in Yorkshire. And we've recently opened a new exhibition and learning centre in collaboration with the University of Huddersfield. It's been open 6 weeks. And in the exhibition, we tell the story of the Holocaust through the eyes of 16 people who experienced it, either as refugees who came here before 1939 but lost a lot of their family, or as survivors of camps of forced labour and of other atrocities. So what you were saying about loss and trauma and people's personal experiences really resonated with me. Obviously, we work with people who've experienced really significant trauma. And that is generational, so it's not just the survivors, it's their children, it's their grandchildren, and their relationship to the history is complex and emotive and challenging. We're finding since we've been open, even in just a short time, that we've got more people now coming forward with stories, they want to share their stories, and that is often difficult for them and traumatic. So I'm really interested in the process of developing the gallery and your ways of working with your participants, volunteers, staff, everybody who was involved really, and what support you had in place or felt that you needed in place to enable people to work with those stories in a supported way. And is there anything maybe in retrospect that you might have done differently or think that you could have done to make that process, I don't want to say easier, because it's never going to be easy for the participants, but just to support them and make sure that they are at the heart of the experience?
Yeah, I mean, we would say we were very conscious of the ethical responsibilities around that, and we would have worked closely with WAVE, Damien represents, and Community Relations Council and others, victims and survivor service and so on. So we would have consulted a lot in terms of our approach, and we identified early on in the project a set of key principles with the academic advisory group that would underpin our approach. And in terms of within the gallery, we have signposted sources of support if people are affected by what they see and where to go to get further support, and we've facilitated some training for our front of house staff as well in how to respond if anybody in the gallery was affected. So it's something that sort of was very much built in to the project. In terms of people coming forward, we had open calls in the gallery to invite people to come forward with objects and stories. We had press releases and media sort of campaigns to bring people forward as well, and worked with them in terms of what they wanted to contribute. Some people gave us objects or stories or photographs. Some people lent us things or just let us copy or digitize something. Some people just rang up and said, "You're the creator of this exhibition and I want you to know this." And it's like, okay, what do we do with that? So it was sort of trying to manage all those different responses, which came from all across the province and all different backgrounds and experiences, from women that worked as a nurse during the Troubles, ex-servicemen, ex-prisoners, all sort of different backgrounds and points of view. So it was sort of managing that and working with them to see how they could best feed into the project. And then once we opened the exhibition, we took a lot of time. We didn't have a launch as such, but we took a lot of time to invite those people that had contributed to see the exhibition and to go around it with myself and see what we had done with their contribution, which was important as well.
Did you want to come in? Can we just maybe pick up on the last part of the question, which I thought was quite interesting in retrospect? You know, I suppose I've heard a lot of discussion here about what happens after an exhibition, and we do all this evaluation and what do we do with it, but I think it's also important to ask, you know, in retrospect, what might you have done differently? Or another question would be, if you were the curator of the show, I mean, you are, Karen, but, you know, is there an object, a story, a thing that you think isn't in there that could be in there? And the reason I say that is because I know that part of the key objective that we agreed was also that this is an ongoing exhibition, in the sense that we're moving away from that sense that exhibitions close and then you open a new one. It's about keeping it open and keeping the space open for new things to happen. So I'm just wondering if Brian or Damien had any sense. If you were the curators, of the museum, is there something that you would have put in, or a story that you would have put in, or a space you would have opened up?
I'd probably just go back to those last two slides I referred to. I'd just like to get back to saying why are we still dealing with this after so many years, and enable it to be a space where anybody who's lived here is able to go in and say, actually, I can relate to that experience. I witnessed something. I lost a friend. I lost, you know, a lot of people who've lost friends and colleagues feel, I'm not a victim, it's not my place to talk about this, but actually you could have that space to say, actually, no, you are welcome to come and speak about this, you know. People from different countries and say, actually, I've had an experience similar to that. I've been through a traumatic experience, whatever it is, whatever the background to it, that it's really just tackling people's sense of isolation. That's only me, it's gone through this, nobody knows how I feel, and I think a museum could be a really good space for tackling that isolation. So that's the thing, that's the word that always sticks with me. You know.
Brian, did you want to?
I just think it's important to show the humanity of people and the individuals involved, because a lot of people here, if they go into the museum and they walk into the Troubles bit and the first thing they see is the usual flags and emblems, they'll just turn and walk out because they're sick to the back teeth of them. And it's getting past that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with flags and emblems or whatever, but it's getting people to not just switch off whenever they see the same stuff over and over again. It's giving it more of a perspective on it. And if they can just bring it down more to the personal stories, and then people realise that, you know, underneath it all, there's a human being, and it doesn't really matter, you know, what side they're from or whatever, but it's very, very hard. People are so, especially older people will sort of want, again, they'll want to see, they'll sort of want to have their prejudices confirmed, a lot of them. Younger people probably won't be any the wiser, and they'll be going in, oh, my granny told me this and such and such. So it's just getting past the usual divisions that you get here over, you know, over history. So how do you do that?
Sorry. I can just say that I feel the Ulster Museum, through silent testimony and the work that Karen has done, they've done a really good job on it, and they should be congratulated for the work they've done so far.
Is there other questions or comments or thoughts from the audience? There's one here, and there's one at the back as well.
Hi, I just wanted to ask Karen if you could just say a little bit more about how you did work with your museum assistants and others who are perhaps, you know, in the galleries, and whether you're carrying on that discussion internally as well as externally with people outside the museum.
Yes, well, as I say, we had training from WAVE in terms of how to respond to working in a gallery that could potentially emotionally affect people that were visiting. And we also did a lot of work to sort of familiarise them with the content and our approach to it, so that if anybody was asking them, they would be able to respond. I think there's more that we can do to enable visitor services staff to discuss some of the objects at length and facilitate tours and so on, because now that the gallery's open, and sort of an answer to Debbie's previous point about, you know, what we would do different and about the capacity, now that that section of work is complete, we're in the next stage of the process that we can do a lot more engagement in this space with community groups, with schools, universities, because there is a lot of interest now and increasing interest. So I want to work more closely with visitor services now that they can help me deliver some of that and be able to use this space more effectively.
Okay. There's a question at the back.
Here.
Sorry?
There's one here.
Oh, there's one. Sorry, go ahead. And then there's one at the back.
I'd like to ask you about unresolved complexity. I'm really interested in the exhibitions being unresolved, that what Brian is talking about is the humanity of all parties, all of them thinking they had a stake in it and the stake was oppositional to other people's stake. Did the staff itself want to continuously resolve it? Was it hard to keep the exhibition unresolved and parallel? How hard was it in your training not to do a summary of what you thought you were looking at?
No, I don't think it was hard, because I think it was always our intention to bring all those different perspectives together. In many ways, the objects themselves can communicate some of that. And yes, we set it in context, and yes, there's text. There's actually two sets of text. There's one that's more about the sort of social, cultural, economic, political history, and references international context and events as well, and one that speaks more directly to the conflict, called Years of Darkness, where we address some of the things where maybe we don't have objects to represent. So we sort of framed it that way. But we didn't actually try to achieve any sort of consensus or agreed narrative or summarize as you go to the exhibition, right, this is how it's all going to neatly tie together for you. It's very much left open, and it's very much left as you've gone through, because it's arranged chronologically as well. It's sort of like you go through a journey, and it's almost in a sense, I think, like a life lived, that you've gone through it and you've seen things from all different sides. You've seen positive and negative, and by the time you come out, it's not really about having a sort of agreed version of it, or it's just sort of coming away understanding this is actually more complex than I thought, and I still got some questions even when I go out.
Okay.
Hello, hi. My name is Jane Wiles. I work at Tate Modern, where I run a program called Tate Exchange, which is a space for conversations to collide. Very much my whole practice has really been kind of like dominated by a lot of like the lessons that I learned as a young person growing up in Belfast. You know, during the week wrestling with kind of my own identity of having a Protestant father and a Catholic mother, but then on my weekends kind of escaping in this amazing, lawless, sweaty box called Gyros, which was a real like hub of a lot of the punk scene. And I think it's really important, Brian, to listen to you and talk about that, because, you know, not to brush anything under the carpet or put a lot of conversations behind, but like that kind of fluidity of my identity and working that out was just something that I couldn't find in other spaces. And I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that and the conditions that allowed that to come out. And I think it's really great to hear you talking about punk in this space. I think that we as museums and institutions have so much to learn from that space of anarchy. And I wonder if the panel have anything to comment on that specifically, on the conditions for speaking and different ideas to collide.
Brian, do you want to start?
I just like to say, yeah, it's Gyros for some reason always seems to get overlooked when people talk about Northern Ireland punk, and I think the reason for, first of all, Gyros was much more politically aware, because I suppose it was inspired a lot by the anarcho bands like Cross and the like, but Gyros did an awful lot of real, like, there's the initial Northern Ireland punk pre-Gyros, which is sort of centred on the Hart Bar and whatever else, and that was a different animal, to be honest. You know, the initial Northern Ireland punk was a reaction against everything. It was a rejection of politics, and the politics that we were rejecting were the politics were around us. And you weren't really, when you were 16, 17, 18, you weren't really thinking much more forward than that. But a lot of the people then that had come along to that, you know, that were involved in the earlier thing, a lot of them then drifted off into whatever else. You know, fashion changed, punk changed, music changed. Certainly after 1981, I wouldn't have regarded myself as a punk at all, because punk by that stage had become a type of music that I didn't like. It had become, to me, it had become a lumpen parody of what the original individuality and excitement of punk was about. To me, it had become a sort of cliche. But on the other side of that, you had got the whole sort of, you know, the anarchist and cross bands who were, music was really like a secondary thing to them. They were more interested in pushing, you know, an ideal and a worldview and whatever else. But that inspired the likes of Gyros and Warzone and whatever else. And to me, they don't get any sort of mention in the punk books. I think it's simply because there were no hit records. The media like to go back, oh, here's Stiff Little Fingers and the Undertones, which is, if that's what you judge Northern Ireland punk by, you're missing 99.9% of what it was about. And Gyros won't get a mention because, again, the bands weren't radio friendly. The media basically ignored them and still do. And Gyros did so much work on the ground, so much more than, say, that the harp was a sort of a, what's the word for it? It was an organic sort of coming together of people, whereas Gyros had sort of like set ideals and whatever else, and they were able to do much more on the ground to help people, you know, with safe and friendly meeting spaces, with their vegetarian cafe and with rehearsal rooms, and, you know, helping bands record and recording studios and putting on gigs. So they actually did much more physically on the ground than the earlier sort of dilettante punks would have done, you know. And certainly there was like a cut off between, there's the earlier punk and then there's this later punk, and then it's just like any sort of youth movement. But certainly Gyros should, you know, as I said myself, I wasn't particularly involved in it. I knew a lot of people were, but certainly, you know, if anywhere here deserves mentioned in the museum and anything to do with Dissent, Gyros was certainly a very important place in the 80s and right through. I mean, I think the last Warzone only just closed a few weeks ago there, and I'm sure they'll come up with something else, you know, so it doesn't go away.
I'm afraid our time has come to an end here, but I think we've heard some really interesting and enlivening stories about the everyday lives that went on during the Troubles, and how this museum is trying to capture some of those stories of everyday life. And perhaps just reflecting on Brian's final comments here, it's left us with a really important question at the end of the conference, which is, how can a punk ethos shape museum practice? So if you can join me in thanking a terrific panel. Thank you.